Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to PTRC's Fireside Chat. I'm Shania from PTRC. I'm the Business Development and Event Manager. At PTRC, we offer 1 and 2 day training courses, as well as our Principles of Traffic and Transport evening lecture series and our annual TPM conference. Excited to share that the program has just been announced. So if you are a speaker watching from the audience, please check that out and hopefully we've all got it well done for you. Tickets are also available. And so yeah, if you have any questions, please find me on LinkedIn or send me an email and I'll be able to give you further information on that. Really looking forward to today's chat. We've got a great panel of experts to discuss the banes and boons of AI. I will now hand you over to the chair of the series, Glenn. Thank you.
Shania, and hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Glenn Lyons. I'm the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at UW Bristol in the UK. 4 years ago, we were wrestling with a pandemic and a climate emergency. Then AI arrived, uninvited, irresistible, and impossible to ignore. Today, it's reshaping transport faster than many of us can make sense of, promising breakthroughs while consuming staggering amounts of energy, water, and attention. Are we witnessing genuine progress or being swept along by hype we didn't ask for? In this session, we'll cut through the noise. We'll ask what AI really offers transport practitioners, what it threatens, and what skills we need to survive or thrive as the genie refuses to go back in the bottle. Did you find that opener punchy? Did it grab your attention? Do you feel primed for today's discussion? Well, that's what Copilot provided me with this morning when I gave it the promotional text for this event, asked it to review it and provide a punchy opening statement that would grab your attention and prime you. Okay, from here on in, it's the real me. Today, we're diving into AI and what it means for the transport sector. Some of you out there may be trying to surf the wave of uninvited change. Some of you may feel you're drowning, pulled under by a riptide of disruption. Some of you may be sat on the beach, not interested in getting in, but looking out at a tsunami racing towards you. For the benefit of those of you on the beach, let me provide a quick primer on some of the terms we may encounter today. The AI we're subject to at the moment is what is known as artificial narrow intelligence. It amounts to machine learning, where a machine is taught to do a specific task using training data to help it improve. Copilot's an example of this. It's a so-called chatbot or digital assistant. It's based on a large language model, or LLM. This is a computer program that's been trained with massive amounts of example data, trillions of words, to predict the most likely next word or sequence of words based on a prompt. The result can appear very human-like, and it has an answer for seemingly everything. A new skill has emerged called prompt engineering. Ability to get the best out of such AI by being able to prime it with suitable instructions from which its predictive response will come. LLMs are one form of generative AI, which creates new content, including text, images, code, audio, and video, by learning patterns from massive datasets. When you use Copilot, there's a health warning it has. Copilot is an AI and may make mistakes, we're told. Imagine the equivalent when a politician stands in front of the cameras at the podium in a smart suit and with flags assembled behind. On the screen below them is the statement. This politician may tell lies and may not have your best interests at heart. Many people will be wary of what they hear. Many will take it in good faith. The challenge for us as professionals is that for the most part, AI has been thrust upon us. It sits there seemingly uninvited on our desktops. It volunteers answers to our search results. Changes seem to be happening faster than we can work out what we're meant to be doing. Added to this, part of our brain may be worrying about how it's affecting our professional life, while another part's worrying about the morality and environmental consequences for society of this latest plaything from the billionaire class. Okay, so it's clear by now that this is a huge and unwieldy topic. It's a wicked problem. And I've not already mentioned specifically by this point what this might mean for transport professionals, which I hope our panel will help with shortly. But I think that's partly the issue. All sectors are being affected by this, not just transport. It's rapidly becoming a boon or bane for the whole economy. And let's be clear, we're all now in a global experiment. At universities, we have something called research ethics. It concerns making sure that the way we conduct research protects the participants involved with the need to weigh up impacts for broader society and the environment. In my view, what we're witnessing in this global experiment is unethical. Those conducting the experiment are affecting us all, and they haven't properly thought through the implications of the experiment and the harms that could arise. Instead, they've blundered in with a suck it and see approach that muddles along and, like AI itself, learns from mistakes, rather than being bound more strongly to the need to avoid mistakes. Now, in my own day job in the transport sector, I have and do use AI. I may not be riding the wave, but I am learning to surf. I'm engaged in what's been called human-machine teaming. I sometimes use AI as a tool, but I'm also getting the hang of realizing the tool's limitations, what it helps with, and where it can be a hindrance. A big part of my day job is dealing with strategic planning in the face of deep uncertainty about the future. In this respect, I feel comfortably uncomfortable with the fact that we really don't know what lies ahead of us at this point. It's about possibilities. One of these is set out in a report from last year called AI 2027. Its authors say, "We've no desire to hype AI ourselves, yet we also think it's strikingly plausible that superintelligence could arrive by the end of the decade. This would take us from artificial narrow intelligence, which is where we are now, into the currently theoretical realm of so-called artificial general intelligence, or AGI, which would have the ability to understand, learn, and apply its intelligence, like a human, to any problem, and perhaps exhibit consciousness and independent thought. Artificial superintelligence beyond this could surpass human intelligence in all aspects, with incredible potential to help or harm humanity." Meanwhile, according to Gartner's hype cycle, as of last year, generative AI has entered the so-called trough of disillusionment, with businesses struggling to see investment returns on their use of AI and to identify suitable use cases and skilled professionals to make it worthwhile. Well, I think that's enough scene setting from me. Can I please encourage you out there in our audience to make use of the chat function to share your views, which will be captured on the recording from today's event? And now it's time to turn to our splendid panel for today, who offer us a mix of transport-specific experience of engaging with AI and wider expertise concerning AI and its possible implications. We're going to hear some opening remarks from each of them now. Michaela, can I come to you first, please?
Yes, thank you, Glenn. Hi, everyone. I'm Michaela. I'm a data scientist at Mott MacDonald. Just a bit of context, Mott MacDonald is a large engineering consultancy, which we do cover a wide range of industries, but I have had the pleasure of working a little bit with the transportation side of things. So I do have a background in statistics and big data, so I do come from it from an angle that is very much more technical rather than understanding the domain. So I do have to rely on domain expertise in my day-to-day job, which would be the transportation practitioners in this case. But working at a consultancy has allowed me to see a lot of changes across all of the industries. And being here for a few years now, I've been able to live in those changes and experience those changes, and the skepticism, the excitement of everyone as well. So over time, these conversations that I've seen when we are trying to implement AI in industries have gone from convincing someone that, the status quo, we can optimize it, we can get more data, trying to inject this excitement into them, and that there is more data to be collected, insights they can grab. And in return, a lot of times the users were very much, they wanted to be in every step of the way, wanting to watch exactly what the AI was doing like a hawk. But then now, after we've seen the explosion of AI, we are now having to convince people on the other side of, maybe AI isn't the tool that will solve their problem, but that, or maybe they think it's going to be Copilot that solves their problem, or some agent that they've interacted with, but actually we have to steer them away to more machine learning, the traditional side of things, because the ChatGPT and Copilot, may not be the application they want. So it's a completely different conversation with them. There's obviously still skeptics that we still have to manage their expectations as well. But now with these new conversations, we have to sometimes convince the end user they still need to be really involved in the process, which is a different conversation. This can definitely be attributed to now everyone has very direct access to AI, and specifically the large language models like Copilot. So they have seen the wow. They asked it to, make a funny picture of their cat, and they thought this was great. So how does this work in my day-to-day? It's going to solve my problems. And, now they're very excited about it. And it is just that accessibility. And on the other side, so being a data scientist and developing these AI solutions, I've had to manage also the change in AI in my day-to-day life. So we do have GitHub Copilot helping us program. And how do we manage using AI ourselves, creating AI? And also with the new development in models, and the different types of models that are out there. So we've heard of ChatGPT, we've probably heard of Claude, which is from Anthropic, we've probably heard of Gemini out there. And how do we apply those models to different use cases, as well as explaining to stakeholders, if we do change the model, we're going to have to go back, and we'll hear more about prompt engineering later, but we are going to have to change the prompt, and it's not going to be a on-off switch to expose the benefits of each individual model. So I think that's kind of where I'm at in my day-to-day with it, and what I hope to bring to this panel today. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Michaela. I'm intrigued because I'm suspecting some of our audience members might associate themselves with being transport modelers. And although you've said you've not got domain expertise, you've applied your data science to transport. And I'm wondering whether that almost does make you a transport modeler. But just a quick follow-up question. Was machine learning there from the very beginning of your career? Let's forget the term AI for a moment. Have you always lived and breathed machine learning, or are you riding this or surfing this wave at the moment yourself?
I am very much machine learning. I specialize in computer vision. Machine learning was what I actually did my master's dissertation in. And actually, particularly my master's, I did with traditional machine learning. So that is actually scraping back farther into the statistics realms, because I'm a statistician as practice. So yeah, definitely. I've had to start to learn to surf the new wave of methodologies, but I will be holding on for dear life on the old methodologies as well.
Okay, so we've got Michaela as an ML native, which Janice will tell us whether or not she's an ML native too. But I think now we're switching from a data scientist applying their expertise in the domain of transport to a transport expert applying AI and data science in her field. So Janice, over to you.
Hi everyone. I'm not a ML native by any means, but definitely been curious. So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Janice Jason. I'm a senior transport planner. And I sit within the Futures and Foresight team within McDonald. So essentially, day to day really looks like helping our clients really think about the future, plan for the future, like Len said, against the context of uncertainty, and really helping them develop those robust policies and strategies. So yeah, very much on the strategic side of things, which I very much enjoy. And then as part of that, a lot of the projects that I do get involved in more recently have been technology related projects. So that has involved kind of doing a long listing of technologies, kind of technology assessments, more on a strategic level, but also planning around specific emerging technologies as well. But apart from that, I guess personally, I've been a keen user of AI, just I guess from the get-go, just because generally I've just been curious how it could be used. So I've tried to introduce new ways of working in our team and in different respects, either to make things more efficiently or do things a little bit more creatively. So that's me in terms of my background. I guess in terms of the question around AI, I think my view is it's the question that we should be asking, for any kind of sort of new technology that comes around, right? It's asking the question of what is the problem that we're trying to fix? What is the issue that we're having? What are the inefficiencies that we're facing? And then trying to understand, okay, where does this technology fit in that context? As opposed to sometimes it can be the other way around, where you have this shiny new technology and we're trying to almost create a problem so that we can make use of the technology. I guess it's a similar question for AI, but I guess that being said, I do personally think AI can have a lot to offer, a lot of opportunities. And when it comes to AI, I think it's more asking the question of specifically when it comes to transport planning, what is AI enabling us to do that we couldn't have otherwise? What are those kind of use cases where it's actually bringing value? And yeah, I think asking that question maybe focuses our efforts a little bit. I think there's a really good example I recently read that's come out of the US, where they were able to just use satellite imagery data, and they were able to use AI to convert that into like a very detailed sort of digitized map of I think it was like a 7-county sort of area, so quite large area. They were able to pick up like the right-of-way features, like where the pedestrian crossing is, where the payments are, the parking, the driveways, and even like where the trees are. And what that enabled them to do then was to identify, for example, I think it was about 20%, only 20% of the pedestrian crossings were actually marked. And there was a significant proportion of the population in that region didn't even have kind of direct access to a pavement. So obviously it helped them kind of then prioritize where they invest and then identify those kind of gaps in infrastructure. I guess, traditionally, such an exercise, you can imagine, would have taken armies and armies of planners and surveys across a period of, I don't know, months, if not years. But now we're able to do that in a week's time, maybe a few months. And yeah, so I think it's really asking that question of scale. What's at scale? What is AI enabling you to do? I guess that being said, I do think there is something to also to be said about us as users and transport practitioners being sort of vigilant or aware of the motivations of the companies that are behind these AI products. Personally, I think a lot of the values that they believe in often are reflected in their products, and maybe we can go into the details of that later on. But I think US, I think, could be another good example where, in terms of, you're obviously seeing a lot of robo taxis being pushed a little bit into the cities. However you feel about the use of robo taxis, I guess you could make an argument that it has more of a use case more in rural areas than in urban areas. But obviously that's not the case, right? You're seeing it being more pushed in urban areas. That's more because you have more users, more people willing to make use of it, and so it's obviously very, very much profit driven in that respect. So I think, I guess when it comes to AI companies and sorts of products they're trying to push, being careful of their motivations, and being wary of that, because sometimes that could be in contradiction to the more societal kind of outcomes approach that we as transport planners can have. So yeah, I think ultimately AI is what you make of it. I think I've seen it being used. I think AI as an amplifier. So it can be an amplifier of your really good intentions, like your noble intentions, but it can be also an amplifier of your selfish intentions, I guess, in a way. So I think it's what you make of it.
Thank you, Janice. And I think you've illustrated very well the importance of not generalizing and homing in on use cases. And really there are examples where it would appear things have been done either more efficiently, more creatively, or simply couldn't have realistically been done before. Of course, there'll be other use cases where it's stumbled and faltered or created unintended and unwelcome consequences. I just wonder briefly if you could reflect on whether for you're currently in your career seeing AI very much as a tool, or in any sense seeing as a competitor to what you do in your day job.
I would say I think it's a good tool to kind of do that heavy lifting for you. Things that would have taken quite a significant amount of time to do. I would say it helps in kind of doing that initial kind of heavy lifting, but obviously ultimately you need to have a view on what it's outputting and kind of work with that. So I wouldn't say it's an almost replacement. It's almost kind of working together with it, and you're able to get something a lot better than if you say were working on yourself. So yeah.
Okay, thanks, Janice. Now, those of you who sort of studied the promotion for today's event may notice that our panel is one short from what was promoted. We may or may not see her later. We're currently missing Anna Jordan, and she is CEO of Alkira Technologies. Unfortunately, with not really any wriggle room for her, at short notice, she was called into a commitment that she couldn't avoid. So she sends her sincere apologies and hopes she might make a late appearance during the conversation. I think Anna represents a great example, if I can represent her fairly, as someone who very much is trying to surf on the crest of this wave within our sector, having established a startup software and machine learning company within the transport sector. And as she put it in her bio, her company is bringing data and evidence into everyday workflows for more productive, optimized and faster transport decision making. I just wanted to briefly mention, in case we don't get to hear from Anna herself, 3 points that came up from her when we were having our pre-meeting with the panel earlier this week. The first thing she said, which I think was really profound, although I won't do it justice in terms of the detail, but she said, if you look at the last 3-month period, the change is like night and day. In other words, a reminder that if you're at the heart of this and really understanding what's changing at the bleeding edge, change is continuing to be very rapid. We found ourselves in a discussion, not surprisingly, and Janice has mentioned, is this a solution looking for a problem? Is there a problem that we needed to be solved with AI that has finally come into its own? What we recognized through talking with Anna was one can also view this, of course, as more of an opportunity not to be missed, rather than a tool that you've desperately been waiting for and couldn't do something that you've needed to do for ages. Now, that doesn't mean the opportunity doesn't also come in tandem with some threats. And I know when we get to Jim and Tom, we may well be reminded of some of those. The last thing that Anna said she'd be pleased for me to mention was her analogy with a sewing machine. And she would have done this much more brilliantly than me. But she'd felt that perhaps this analogy worked well, in the sense that the sewing machine is a tool. But I suspect if all of you in the audience imagined it was put in front of you now and you were asked to make a beautiful garment to go to a fancy event in a couple of weeks' time, some of you would panic and run away from the sewing machine altogether. Some of you would have a jolly good go and produce an utterly awful, let's class it as modern art, an utterly awful garment, and it would require a really skilled operative, a tailor or a seamstress, to really get the best out of that tool for the purpose that it could serve. And I think that was Anna's message really in terms of how we need to not just judge AI in and of itself in terms of its effect in our sector, but also the fact that it ultimately requires an operative to get the best from it. And in the wrong operative's hands, it can probably do more harm than good. Anyway, Anna, I hope that's done reasonable justice to points you've made in your absence. But now, please, let's come across to you, Tom, if we may. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Glenn. Hello, everyone. My name's Tom Stoneham. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of York, and I'm also ethics lead in our Centre for Doctoral Training in Safe AI Systems, which is funded by the UK Research and Innovation Council and also has some philanthropic funding. Safe AI Systems, I'm going to say a word about too. I'm not a transport professional in any sense. I'm a transport user. But several of our partners in the Centre for Doctoral Training are heavily involved in transport. And in particular, we have a partnership with Jaguar Land Rover, with DNV, the shipping company, and with NATS, Air Traffic Control. Now, if when you hear safe AI systems, you start thinking about superintelligence, you might think, what are people like that wanting to partner with us for? And that's because we're working within a very specific conception of safety, that which is completely different from the Sam Altman conception of safety. Sam Altman famously said last year, yes, we're very concerned with safety. We make sure we just release things in limited areas and see what the damage is, and then we improve them before they go out to the 800 million monthly users. Our approach to safety is different. It's safety assurance. We're interested in making sure that our AI systems are safe, are assured to be safe before there any harms can come about. What does a philosopher do in such a project? Well, there are two things about safety. It's the reduction or hopefully elimination of unacceptable harms, and philosophers are useful in understanding what's both unacceptable and what's a harm. I'm pleased Janice mentioned robo-taxis because that helps me explain a little bit about this. I'm actually very excited. I'm in Shanghai next month and I'm going to be riding in my first robo-taxi, and I'm very excited by that. I think robo-taxis are a great idea, and very soon it'll be clear that they will reduce the number of accidents per mile driven. But robo-taxis also have other effects. So you can see a safety benefit there, but we can also think more generally about what are going to be the consequences of introduction of these. So, take a typical nuclear family, two parents, two-car family, two or three kids. First thing in the morning, parents need to get to work, the kids need to get to different places. Currently, that's a logistics problem. How do you put the right people in the right cars and plan the right route? There's a real risk, I think it's a risk, that the introduction and the ubiquity of robo-taxis means that you'll just pop each kid in a different taxi going off to where they go. Gives you an extra 10 minutes in the morning to drink coffee before you leave for work. But that then increases the number of vehicles on the road from 2 to potentially 5 per family. And any potential gains in incidents per mile driven are lost. So we're interested in thinking about systems in that way. And that's where the philosophers and sociologists in our team come into play. And it's not just the impact in incidents per mile driven if you increase the miles, but the more vehicles you have on the road, the more that cities have to be individual vehicle centric rather than public transport or cycling centric, the more that affects lifestyles and urban design and cost of infrastructure. So this is what thinking through a lifelong approach to safety involves for us. And that's kind of the day job. One of the things I want to say more generally about AI, though, is I'm a very strong believer that we're at an inflection point, a choice point. People often ask about what's the future of AI, where are we going to be in a few years' time? And there is a narrative being driven by Silicon Valley about the future of AI. And this is the narrative that the future of AI is ever larger foundation models trained on now trillions of parameters, which are general purpose. They may not be general intelligence, but they're general purpose. And then, as Glenn was talking about, Anna's views, then you learn skills of getting what you need out of these. They're a very general purpose tool, like a sewing machine. And then there's a whole amount of work of prompting and manipulating these very, very powerful, in one sense, tool to get the specific result you want. And that's the narrative being driven by Silicon Valley. And that's the narrative where the $650 billion of investment into AI this year alone is backing. And that has real problems. The environmental impact is huge. The data centers for the training need huge amounts of energy, but the inference also needs a huge amount of energy because these are general purpose tools. Some of the tasks we set them are much more energy intensive than others. If you ask ChatGPT a question which has an answer in English, and you compare that to the energy used to asking it to do a fairly basic arithmetic operation, the arithmetic operation will be somewhere between 1 and 2 orders of magnitude more energy used for the inference, simply because they're not designed to do that very well. And so they have to put in all sorts of extra processing. And that's the problem with a general purpose tool. We've got one narrative, the Silicon Valley narrative, the general purpose tool that we then learn to manipulate to get the results we want. But there's another story, and there's another possible future, which is to use pre-trained models, smaller pre-trained models that we can fine-tune to specific tasks that we need in specific organizations and specific sectors. And then we can run these locally on more efficient hardware that's tuned for the specific model that we've got. And also, by doing that, we reduce dependence upon these software as a service companies. So there is another future which involves a different approach, not the massive co-pilot approach, but the fine-tuned. You can do it. You can go and download a copy of Gemma 3 or Llama and run it on your laptop. It's a bit slow and your laptop will overheat, but if you've got a good gaming computer, it'll run fine. You can then adapt that and tweak it. It's an open weights model. You can model it for your own purposes. And I think this is our choice point. We have to decide which future we want to go for. And final point, I think apart from the environmental impacts, I think there's a really important issue within transport especially, but also in lots of other sectors, which would make us more interested in that smaller model approach. And that's about control. I'm sure everyone in the audience remembers CrowdStrike in July 2024, where most flights around the world were grounded for quite a long time because of a bug in a software update to the kernel security in Windows. And this was dramatic in its effect. And it showed the impact of outsourcing. Both Microsoft themselves outsourced, but also other people were outsourcing to Microsoft a lot of their IT infrastructure. And the places that recovered quickly were the ones who had technicians on hand who could go and restore those computers. They needed someone to access them physically. The places that recovered slowly were the ones who didn't have their own people on hand who knew what to do. And I think we're going to hit that point with AI where we have to think very carefully. do we know how to recover from failure if it happens to us, or are we reliant on someone flying in from San Francisco to fix it for us? So that's my view for the future, and I hope it appeals to you as well.
Thank you, Tom. I must say, when your comparison or your reference to an inflection point and the distinction between going forward in a general purpose tools way with software as a service versus more tailored and arguably more efficient localized models as the alternative does remind me of the analogy which within the transport sector, which concerns mobility as a service, which has stuttered and stumbled and been through the hype cycle where lots of individual local authorities have been trying to create this notion of an all-you-can-eat mobility app that brings everything together in one place for efficiency and convenience for the user. And generally, the message has been this has been floundering. Meanwhile, across the world, Google Maps navigation has essentially been doing that for everyone, not quite to the extent you could do with a more tailored approach. And of course, the economy of scale and the familiarity with a single generalized offering is winning out very clearly. And so I do wonder whether the inflection point is running away from us rather than being a true choice that we have at our disposal to make right now. Did you want to just react to that?
I'd love to react on the maps point because I think it's a very interesting one. I personally don't use Google Maps. I use other maps app which draw on OpenStreetMaps. And one of the really interesting things I've noticed, I live in Yorkshire. I like to get out and about. And the mountain rescue are always complaining about people using mapping software on their phones, and they mean Google Maps. Whereas the mapping software on my phone, it has contour lines, it has footpaths. These are all layers that have been put there by actually largely volunteers in an open source mapping environment. And it runs with offline maps as well. So all I need is that GPS connection. So actually, while Google Maps seems the obvious thing if you're trying to do a transport connection in a big city, it's not actually winning out in all contexts because Google doesn't care about whether the mountain rescue team is called out for someone who got lost in the fog in the hills. And we need to make sure we have people who do care about each of those use cases and each of those risks to make sure we have the tools that are useful.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Jim, you've been waiting patiently, and patiently indeed in the sense that you've been in this field most of your career, I think. So we've all intruded upon it to some extent. Obviously, Michaela and Janice have arrived probably slightly more late recently than you did at the beginning. Over to you for your story.
So, hi everyone, I'm Jim Smith. I'm a professor of interactive AI at UWE Bristol. And for my sins, I've been teaching and researching AI since the mid-90s. And Glenn's intro was perfect for me because one of the things that came out of a public meeting I did in November was walking away thinking, I should have AI is not ChatGPT tattooed on my forehead. And I just wanted to raise right from the start something that we get across in our teaching is that there are, crudely speaking, three types of AI, of which machine learning is one, making predictions using a trained model is the other. But there's a really key part, which is optimization, which is a thing of saying, when I've got a model and I know what I'm trying to achieve, what are the sequence of inputs that get me to the right place? That's the problem that SatNav solve. And when I looked at the Department for Transport's AI use uptake roadmap, a lot of the transport problems they're describing in there are still optimization problems. How do you configure X, Y, and Z? How do you plan the most efficient roadmap? How do you adapt to stuff and re-planning, find the right sequence of events? Those are optimization problems that are not naturally the realm of LLMs. Now, it's interesting that one of the things they talk about was we should have some giant geospatial foundation model And that kind of fits into this use of digital. It's be like a digital twin of the UK's infrastructure that you can then use as a cheap way of solving optimization problems. So you can try out lots of possibilities before you have to go to the real world and optimize and to test things out. But a lot of the fundamental problems are still optimization problems. Why does that matter? It matters because if any, having, as I said, 30 years of working on many industrial collaborations internationally and with local people, some of which have been in the transport sector, some of which have been about safety cases for various kinds of autonomous vehicles. It's made me realize that context is everything. And this is where the interactive in my job title comes from. I'm going to give a very, very quick example of this that I used for my first year teaching. It's about the vehicle routing problem. So you've got a load of things you need to take from one place to another, and you've got a load of vehicles you could use to do those, and you've got to try and define the best schedule to do that. If that problem is how do you work out where you're going to sequence sending airplanes on certain routes for the next month's time, and most of the stuff is fairly predictable about what you're going to do, and fuel costs, especially right now, are going through the roof, and downtime is a very expensive thing to do because you're leasing your projects. You might well go, this is the schedule I'm going to start implementing in a month's time, so I can, because I've got to publish my timetables, therefore I can happily spend 2 weeks with a very expensive supercomputer optimizing the heck out of this. However, another context for exactly the same problem is you've got a fleet of delivery vehicles and you've got your latest load of stuff from the post office or Amazon or whoever it is that you're delivering stuff from that day. You're working in a noisy environment where your estimates about how long will it take you to drive from one part of the city to the next have obviously got a large amount of noise relative to them. You don't want to spend an hour with your drivers sitting doing nothing in the delivery yard while you work out the most efficient way to do it, because that's not the appropriate thing. And my concern is that the use of using large language models and things like that to try and solve transport problems risks that human aspect of saying, actually, for my context, exactly what is it that I need to optimize? Is it maximum efficiency? Is it some trade-off of how long is it going to take me to get a good solution versus what's the quality of that solution? Those are human aspects which usually need to be defined. Well, you can try and define them, but actually no one ever tells you what you got, exactly all the factors that are going to impinge on their day-to-day things. So I guess my first point is context is everything, especially in the transport world where you're talking about people, where it's really, really hard for humans to say up front what are all the important things. That's why rules-based AI has failed and started failing in the 60s, because it's just too hard to specify all the relevant factors and all the things we just take for granted. So AI as a way, so large language models as a way of fast tracking the generation of solutions to stuff, I think they need to be taken into account. The next thing, I guess, is that most people in education or most people involved in maintaining the kind of open source repositories which lots and lots of scientific endeavor and things like Linux, which power most of the world's key infrastructure, work on, are dealing with this problem of what do you do about the fact that AI generated code isn't very good? It typically has a large amounts of slop in it. And what most educators will say, well, you use that as your first draft, but then you have to apply your knowledge and your context to say, how do I make this better? How do I embed my knowledge to really generate something? And that kind of ties into the point about the sewing machines, is that it's not like you can't expect things to generate stuff. Well, especially as there's an analogy of kind of, I tend to think the way that AI generated stuff is coming onto the internet, estimates that half of the bots that are active on social media or the accounts on social media are bots. Half of the content of the internet is now AI generated. AI slop, I think, is going to be the microplastics of the future, or the things that we're worried about polluting the oceans. And we're moving into a world then of hallucination augmented generation, because the large language models are going to be read on stuff they've created. And then final point, because I've probably taken too long, is how do we stop AI becoming an acronym for augmented inequality? In the world of healthcare and privacy and stuff, where a lot of my research has been of late, they've got very clear guidelines about when they're creating AI-based models, they assess their impact on different groups of people. And the Information Commissioner's Office has very strict guidelines around this in terms of you have to assess the equality of their predictive for different groups of people defined by protected characteristics to make sure that you're not putting in place something which disadvantages some groups of people. I think the key question for transport is, what are the relevant groups of people we should be thinking about? How do you add people in rural communities into that mix if you're thinking about going back to the example of robo-taxis? So how do you quantify or start to put together, these are groups of people we should make sure that we're not living in some utilitarian world where all the robo-taxis are in cities because that's where they can make the most money. So how do we make sure people in rural communities, especially those who for whatever reason can't drive, are being perfectly well surfaced? And I don't know the answer to that problem. But
Jim, and just briefly, I mean, I think the recasting of AI to augmented inequality possibly trumps my mum's frustration about it being artificial insemination. But do you think that the horse has already bolted in terms of that stable door trying to be closed now? I suppose it partly relates to Tom's points about ethics and safe systems, in that in an ideal world, we might have gone at a slower pace and not asked for forgiveness, but asked for permission and tried to establish more clearly the ground rules for responsible evolution or revolution with AI. So do you think we're in a position now where we're faced with irresponsible AI?
I think you can't avoid the fact that irresponsible people are doing things which are leading to potentially irresponsible uses of AI. So Anthropic's saying they're not going to release their latest version of their code generation engine because they've tested it out and it's better at creating cyber attacks than people are. No, it's yes, the genie is out of the bottle. That doesn't mean that. I don't think it means that it's too late to put in guardrails around it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be we can't say, okay, we are where we are, but how do we embed that duty of care, that sense of responsibility, that sense of making sure that groups of people aren't being disadvantaged?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Jim. I'm conscious we've got some various questions coming in from the audience, so that's a fantastic sort of scene setting with a very rich diversity of issues raised. The first question from the audience, Michaela, I might turn to you on this to pick up on the sewing machine analogy. And audience members said, regarding that analogy, surely the purpose of tools, and particularly AI, is to make working with data easier and more manageable, by which I assume it means we should have sewing machines that don't need you to be capable of being so good at sewing in order to produce garments. So I wondered what your experiences have been of late in terms of, do you think the skills of a data scientist are ultimately at the heart of making better garments, or are you coming across better and better AI that makes you feel as though your skill sets are less and less critical to delivering good outcomes when you're applying it to use cases?
Yeah, I think the answer is a bit twofold. I don't think it's binary. It's not one way or the other. And I think particularly there's a lot of redundancy that we do, or we have very low level people, I think, across industries. You have somebody sorting papers, and you have somebody in like an office setting, and you have somebody just making sure all the files are in order and all of the just the very like menial tasks that don't bring much fulfillment. And I think what AI can do is, bring up that bar and actually get people to researching and grabbing, more insights and, advancing the industries by making sure that, you're not spending the first 5 years of your career just pencil pushing and moving things around. And, so for in data science, specifically with the programming code, which I've done, or like the AI programming assistance, there is a bit of, you spend enough time digging through documents to figure out the actual function you need to use, or you spend setting up all these very basic functions. And, is that 30 minutes of your time that can be spent elsewhere and ballooning beyond that? I think everyone's skills will still be needed because we are all experts in our own respective fields. And I think we will never get to a point where we're completely out of the loop. And we should never accept that we're completely out of the loop either.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just thinking about the voice of God I sat next to a couple of weeks ago, who was telling me that her industry has been seriously compromised now by substitute voices of God that are AI generated, of course. So I guess, again, I suppose it's context specific, picking up Jim's point.
Yeah. I think also on that, I think change is scary. And I think sometimes the anxiety in people's brain that says like, oh, this is changing, like everything is done, everything, AI is taking over everything. And I feel that way as well. Sometimes that changes, is going to happen. And sometimes you do have to just sit down after the initial scare of AI's taken my job to actually, my job is still here and I'm still working. It's just taken away this menial task and it, let the waves settle a little bit.
Yeah, that's a helpful point. So I guess each of our roles conceivably now is evolving. There will be some ultimate casualties in terms of job types that were traditionally seen as secure that have been compromised, or the scale of numbers of jobs needed has gone down. But broadly, the workforce is evolving to accommodate this new tool, perhaps. Tom, we've got a question that's specifically targeted at you regarding your safe systems comments, which I guess you've perhaps seen already, but just to paraphrase, what are the biggest risks with this safe systems thinking and how well are we doing in addressing them?
I think it's a really great question. And the written version I've just seen mentions social, economic, physical. And certainly in the areas we tend to work, people are very, very concerned with physical harm and are very focused on that and want to remain very focused on that and are prepared to slow down rollout. But we're beginning to see issues in that space. For example, Android Auto is now using Gemini as a user interface, and Gemini with some agentic capabilities. And this generates real problems in cars with some low levels of autonomy that we haven't really understood, that our previous work on assuring machine learning systems in autonomous systems was not assuming that it would be a user interface. And so I think there's the risk of physical harm is people using LLMs with agentic capabilities as user interfaces. But my own biggest concern is around the social economic harms. I think we are in a position where it's a bit like we were with social media 15 years ago. We could do something now. With social media, we could see the goods and we couldn't see the harms back then. Now I think we're more attuned to what the harms might be, socially and economically. The economic harms of social media have not been trivial. And so I think a focus on those will help us bring in various control mechanisms and regulation so that we won't be cleaning up the mess afterwards in the way we're trying to do with social media at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Jim, there's a question which I think implicitly is for you, having mentioned optimization. The question asker is saying they're deliberately provocative. But do you get a sense that optimization by its nature is constraining us to evolution rather than more transformative change through, or perhaps other forms of machine learning and AI? But then I suppose their rider on that is saying, well, we've already got a pretty inefficient set of systems at the moment. Optimization sounds like more transformative than we're giving it credit for. I hope I've paraphrased the sentiment from behind the question, but would you like to react to that?
Oh, you just handed me a hobby horse and invited me to ride off into the distance, as my PhD was actually in something called evolutionary computation. Actually, well-designed optimization techniques are quite good at thinking out of the box. I think this is one of the things that AI actually, applied sensibly, AI can be really good at, is this kind of assumption-free thinking, where you're simply saying, these are the parameters of what I'm trying to optimize. Come up with something. There was a great example, this was borderline tangential to the transport world, of NASA needed to devise something to sit on top of one of their Skylab, I think it was, to hold a particular device, and that so it'd be isolated from vibrations in the plane. And they used an evolutionary optimization algorithm to come up with this, and it was something that no human would have looked at. And when they sort of unpicked the design to see why did it work so well, it's because each individual component was a different length, so you didn't get vibrations traveling through. And that was just because somehow, especially evolutionary algorithms, are really, really good at kind of avoiding all those human preconceptions and stuff like that. Doesn't mean they necessarily work. So I guess so. To be deliberately counter-provocative, I think evolution as a method of doing stuff, and you can use evolution to create models as well, it tends to give you slightly better results than what we currently train with AI models, well, ML models with, just it takes longer. So I think we are perhaps insufficiently well harnessing the creative possibilities of AI in coming up for solutions. But I very much of the camp that says what we need is human machine teaming. We need, I would usually say, you want a good team is one where one of the partners comes up with a load of solutions or potentials, and then you can consider them collectively, or the human can say, okay, that looks great, I want this trade-off because.
Yeah. And I suppose maybe we can't escape Anna's sewing machine, because I suppose part of that is some of us would look at a sewing machine and if we're broadly competent, think, well, I can knock out a dress or a pair of trousers, but actually a more creative kind of evolutionary, in the sense of the way you've described, Jim, would say, I'm not just seeing a sewing machine, I'm seeing an opportunity to do something that's never really been done before with textiles and produce something that has real appeal and benefit as a result. But I suppose that perhaps brings us back across to as another question, and Janice, I'll head in your direction for this to start with. This notion that Tom raised of general purpose tools, which can be universal, but perhaps rely upon an assumption of resource abundance in order to do that, as opposed to Tom's put it on your own machine, might take a bit longer, but it's tailored and more fit for purpose and efficient. I know you had an example you wanted to raise about the environmental implications of use cases in transport, but that, as you will appreciate, will lead us on to, well, if that sits on top of a general purpose tool, maybe the general purpose tool in the round is causing a bigger problem than we realise. So what are your thoughts, I guess, on the environmental implications that we're dealing with here?
I think before I get into the environmental implications of it, I think it's worth noting. I think this was a line actually I just recently came across, and it was actually made by a product lead in Google. And I'll just read it out. So it says, not all problems are AI problems, and more critically, not all AI problems are generative AI problems. And I think that reflects a lot of what Michaela, you've said, Tom, you said, like, I think we've all kind of coming to that same conclusion of, while at the moment LLMs and general purpose models are getting a lot of the spotlight, it isn't of the obvious solution. But at the moment, because there's kind of all this pressure on organizations and teams to show that they're using AI, it almost has become like the default thing that they go to. So I think there's something definitely to be said around that. And Google itself, they have a really useful resource I just came across where it's kind of like a flow chart, which helps you decide on if generative AI is the solution for you based on, what kind of outputs you want, what kind of data you have. So yeah, I think definitely something to be said around that. In terms of the environmental impacts, yeah, I think again, I think it comes a little bit back to also how efficient the models themselves are. I think a very stark kind of figure that I got to come across when I was doing the literature review for the project I mentioned was, I think, when you compare the very not so very inefficient kind of generative AI models, and you compare it to the most efficient, the energy use is almost 70 times. So that's a huge difference, and I think that ultimately comes down to the location that your data centers may be, the water usage, how efficient your chips may be, and those sorts of things. So I don't think it's a simple answer in terms of the environmental impact. I mean, obviously there's environmental impacts, but I think there's nuances in terms of specific kind of components, background components that are being used, and that can have a really huge impact in terms of the differences that you see. And then I guess that's kind of the bad side. And then in terms of the reductions it could cause, there's the specific paper, I think it was the London School of Economics, what they found was, so I think they did a study just for 3 sectors alone. So it was power, mobility, and food. And what they found was the carbon reductions as a result of the use of AI, and just in those sectors alone, was able to kind of negate the negative impacts of carbon worldwide from all the sectors. So obviously, very huge claim there. And I think the conclusions that we came about in that study was, I think it ultimately comes down to the Jevons paradox. Obviously, we talk a lot about that as well when it comes to AI. And I think more than anything, that's what's causing the whole big question mark around, because the more efficient you have something, so even if you were able to find really efficient ways to cool your water systems and really efficient ways to like have your chips produce the least amount of heat and things like that, making it efficient itself will increase usage, and you'll have compounded environmental impact. So I think it's a bit of, I think as users being very careful, obviously where we can, in terms of having that knowledge in knowing which tools to use and having control, I guess, from the user's point of view, where we can. And obviously, I think also something to be said about, the hardware efficiencies haven't caught up as well as software efficiencies have. So maybe we will see more efficient ways of doing things, and maybe it won't be the case that it's so environmentally bad. But I think that's just where I stand on that.
Thanks for that, Janice. I know perhaps Tom, maybe Jim as well, will want to come in. It does seem to point back to your point, Jim, about it comes down to the actors involved. Some are less scrupulous than other actors. And of course, those who are choosing to be most scrupulous in terms of their own efficiency might be disadvantaging themselves in other ways, in a kind of rat race mentality, which is creating a race to the bottom, but you don't want to feel you're left behind. So there's a conundrum in there. But Tom, I don't know what your sense is, if we kind of move our lens a bit to data centers, and there's a good news story Janice is suggesting in terms of here AI has produced a net benefit. But has that truly been the case, or has it been resting upon something underneath the surface that is worse than we thought?
Well, I'm not going to comment on that particular study because all these studies have to make assumptions and they're all debatable. But I think the thing that I think two things we don't need to think about with the environmental impact. So one is the appetite for energy. So forget the carbon footprint for a moment and just consider the appetite for energy of these technologies. They are the most energy intensive, as they're currently being built, technologies that we've ever had. I mean, it's well known that as a civilization develops and develops new technologies, it uses more energy. But this is a step change, and we see that there was a report out of Ofgem in February, which revealed that the requests for new connections to the UK national grid, primarily from data centers, amounted to 50 gigawatts. And just for a comparison, on the coldest day of the year so far, our peak energy consumption was 45 gigawatts. So what people are planning to build in the UK will double our energy consumption. And there just has to be consequences of that. Energy has to come from somewhere, and that's where we talk about carbon footprint, but it has to go somewhere. It generates heat. And you can think of closed loop cooling systems, but they're still cooling systems. It's generating heat. And the other thing is, it's not just carbon footprint. There are other environmental impacts, and a lot of proposals for current data centers, including in the UK, involve powering them with nuclear. We've already got proposals to reopen closed nuclear sites. We're getting the development of small modular reactors. The big AI companies are actually building their own power stations because of the demand, and they are putting a lot of pressure on regulators to be allowed to build power stations of types that were not previously allowing to be built for the environmental reasons. So yeah, I think the overall environmental impact, it will be very hard to offset it against any improvements. I just think the numbers don't add up. But yeah, there will be offsets, there will be improvements. But it's like, I could reduce my personal carbon footprint by going out tomorrow and buying an electric car, but that doesn't take into account the manufacturing of a new car compared to keeping my reasonably efficient small petrol engined car going for another 5 years. So, we have to look at the systemic level impacts of this big pivot.
So yeah, it's a reminder again of the wicked problem that we're confronting here. Jim, I'm going to come to you, and maybe I am keen we come back to your augmented inequality. I know you've made a couple of points in our chat here about using excess heat as a form of district heating, and so one can see sort of second order effects to the first order negatives that could become more positive, and you start to neutralize, and so has been the nature of evolution and innovation, I suppose, over generations. But this issue of augmented inequality does seem fundamentally worrisome, because our track record in terms of good governance and responsible innovation isn't terribly good. We know we've got widening social inequality, certainly in terms of income inequalities, and it doesn't sound like this is going to solve that problem. But where do you see that heading over the next couple of years? Is it giving you increasing cause for concern, or do you think that there is a chance to apply good sense and start locking in the benefits and taking out the downside risks?
I actually feel reasonably positive about this, because it's a problem that has been known now. The inequalities due to certain genders. I think the transport sector, the fact that safety belts were designed for male crash test dummies, which mimics the male body, for example. We've known about the problems for a very long time. And I think actually within a lot of sectors, people are starting to really clearly address this. So it's baked into the ICO's toolkit. Certainly within the health sector, there's a real push to say we really do need to make sure that people from a range of different communities, they're being represented in the data, their data is being represented. Therefore, when we build the models that are going to drive this, so if we have a digital twin of the UK's transport networks, which allows us to do all this kind of what if type thinking, which is sort of going back to the point about evolutionary change, I suppose, making sure we've got all the right information there is possible. And I think where it's really clear who the groups that might be disadvantaged, some really good steps are being made. So I'll get now the obvious ones about protected characteristics, but increasingly people saying, okay, so we know that the study of what happened with the COVID pandemic was largely driven by studies on people from a given background, and not everything was as useful as it could have been from people from other parts of the world, whatever. So that kind of making sure that underrepresented communities' voices are being held is perhaps more obvious in the health sector about they can do that, and there's real work, and there's government initiatives like Our Future Health, which are trying deliberately aiming to reach all those different sectors. So I kind of feel that if you know who it is, that if it's obvious who those sectors are, that you need to make of that we can address them. I'm just not entirely convinced by what I've seen that there's the same clarity within the transport network about who are the groups that need to be reached. The impact of road traffic on air quality, it's the road traffic air quality modelling tends to be at a relatively low spatial resolution. So you don't quite get the kind of what's the impact of the people living really close to the motorway and stuff like that. Steps are being taken rapidly. I think AI can help this sort of stuff, but I think it's maybe raises more social questions about who are the groups of people we really care about.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. What I'd like to do now, and I'll start with you in a moment, Michaela, is sort of we've gone up to the helicopter view, which we knew we would. And I'd like to try and come back in now to the lived experience of professionals. Now, Tom, Jim, feel free to riff outside or inside the transport sector on this, but particularly for Michaela and Janice. And it is a bit of a thought experiment I'd like you to do, which is just to contemplate, given what we heard from Anna about light and day change over a 3-month period, if we give ourselves 3 years, so we're sort of knocking on the door of the end of the decade. Of course, we might have artificial superintelligence and the end of life on Earth as we know it, or the beginning of wonderful life on Earth, just possibly. Or it might be much more banal, more of the same, muddling along. So I'm keen to get your views, and they will be speculative, but your views and advice, I suppose, for those in the audience about what they might be in for over the next 2 or 3 years. I have to say my own sense is that it's the pace of all of this that's sort of slightly wrong-footed us all. If we had a bit more forewarning and got ourselves prepared, we might be feeling less decompobulated. But it feels very messy at the moment. It feels like there's a big headache we've all got because we haven't quite worked out what sits where and where it's good and where it's not. We don't have processes and organisations as clearly and as quickly as we hoped we would have had, and it's changing in all the while underneath us. But actually, it is all within bands of artificial narrow intelligence, which is a tool, a predictive tool, and therefore we'll come to terms with that. And I'm not sure artificial general intelligence will necessarily appear, in which case we might look back in 3 years and say, gosh, didn't we get excited in the kind of mid-2020s? It caused quite a bit of panic, but some of those big tech pro companies have gone bust, and some of them sold at high share values and ran off into the hills. And now we're left with a further evolution in the way that we use computational tasks to deal with the data that we're generating in society. And we've still got traffic congestion. We've still got social inequality. People are still worried about the bus not turning up on time. And life hasn't changed so much. And I'm still a transport planner. So that's a kind of starter for 10 from me. But Michaela, I know it's a tough question, but where would your mind take us over the next 2 to 3 years of possibility?
Sorry, it wouldn't come off mute. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting one. Particularly, I think with everything, day to day, there's a new model coming out, a new methodology, and I think there is a point where right now we're in the middle of this big storm of all of these changes, and I think it's okay to sometimes just turn your blinders on to all the new innovations. If you are perfectly happy with the way things are going, you can't ignore it forever, and I think it's accepting, and right now is accepting every new tool that comes out in this space doesn't have to work for your current problem. And you don't have to spend time trying to force it to work and fix your problem now, because it may not be the tool for the job. In particular, in the space that I mainly work in, computer vision, there was new models coming out in the late, naughty 2010s, and that it was every single year, brand new innovation. We haven't really seen anything in the vision space since, the Gen AI has taken on. That doesn't mean Gen AI won't take on my work, but, maybe we can come to a conclusion and now vision is coming back, and I think it all comes in waves. And so I think in 3 years' time, I mean, we could be looking at, I have no idea what we're going to be looking at in 3 years' time. And I think it's just embrace now. And, just start to figure out, what are you trying to get out of AI? And if it's not working for you now, there's probably something coming in next week that might be the solution.
That's very helpful, Michaela. And I think it reminds me of our pre-meet discussion where, in a sense, that's my analogy of being sat on the beach versus being in the waves or sucked under. We have got to learn to try and do a bit of surfing rather than just sit on the beach, because the longer we sit on the beach, the greater the chances are the waves are going to be too big for us to cope with. I think in terms of order, I'll come to Tom and Jim for your kind of reflections on that 3-year outlook, and then I'll loop back to you, Janice, and then probably we'll be saying time's nearly up for us, and so if there is time, I'll do a quick round robin of what are your takeaway messages. But Tom, I'll come to you next.
Thanks. So one of the things I'm often very struck by is studies of automation bias. And typically studies of automation bias, they look at how often people take the recommendation from the AI when they shouldn't in their own area of expertise. And so there's one very nice study showing this in radiology. And what's striking about this is automation bias. Younger, or more junior, should we say, radiologists were more susceptible to automation bias than more senior. And the authors of the report didn't quite manage to say this, but they was clearly in their heads that, well, this is because younger people are kind of more in the technology space and they're more susceptible to technology. But I reflected on that quite a lot, and I realized that the reason a senior radiologist is less susceptible to automation bias is that a senior radiologist spends most of their time checking other people's work. That's what they do. The junior radiologist looks at the X-ray and makes the first judgment. The end of the day, the end of the week, the senior radiologist checks their judgments. And that spurred me to think that, the most important thing in any area now as a practitioner is to develop those skills of checking other people's work. Because the skill of checking other people's work is the skill you need, whatever the AI is going to be, whatever the future is going to be. And so I think that's the best way to ride the coming wave, is to develop that.
That sounds great, Tom. I've just written down, I'm not sure you would quite call it this, but check engineering to go with prompt engineering. So you need sort of both bookends to get the best out of this. Jim, what are your thoughts? Your crystal ball is out.
I absolutely like what Tom's just said. I mean, goes back to my point about education, as the skill of essay writing is no longer kept to people who've been to a certain level of education, because ChatGPT will do that. It'll just fill it often with garbage, but the structure will be beautiful. I think so it's about I think in 5 years' time, it'll be two things. It'll be one is more realization of AI can be a great tool for some things, but also people who are more skilled in recognizing that the outcomes of generative AI in particular, treat it as your first draft. You get used, people will be more used to querying stuff. And I think some of that comes down to the way it's presented. I'm a project we did where we were supposed to be detecting defects in steel, the application, and people hated what we did. It wasn't very good until we changed it slightly and just put a green ring around things and said, "What's this? Pay attention to this. Is this important?" Of which stage they really liked it, and it proved to be a useful tool. And that's just about the presentation of what you're finding. And it makes me think of the difference between originally we had paper map. If we wanted to find out to go to A to B, we had paper maps and they've triangles of numbers saying how far it was to help you plan your route. Then we had crude sat navs, which had static things, which just said, what's the shortest distance, did it? Well, I was in Costa Rica 2 or 3 years ago, and everyone there used Waze because it gets updated. It's truly an interactive system that got updated as in heavy rain periods and roads were being washed away. You could rely on it to be right moment to moment because it had lots of people interacting and continuously updating it. I think that kind of tool, so it's all for me about how do you manage that human machine teaming most effectively.
Right. Thank you, Jim. I'm scribbling away as you're all talking. I'm going to come back to the sewing machine analogy towards the end. But Janice, what do you make of this? I should just say, Janice and I work together in our day jobs. And what I've loved about Janice's approach to this is the very open-minded, explorative journey that you were going on and taking some others of us on. And I think that's probably the spirit again of learning to surf and possibly becoming quite a good surfer now. But after 3 million years of learning to surf, do you think you'll be on the crest of the wave, or where do you imagine things will be in the next 3 years?
I think it's difficult to say, but I'd like to think that we at least in 3 years' time, I'd like to think we would have made a conclusion on if it's either Bane or boon. I'd like to think more on the opposite side, but that being said, I think ultimately it just comes back to our role as transport planners, right? What does it come down to? Ensuring public transport is on time, like you said, Glenn, like improving public transport, making us streets safer, reducing car dependency, all those kind of fundamental things. I don't think it's a case of us needing to wait another 3 years of needing for AI to like be its best self for us to do that. We can still do that now. There might be certain areas that, like I said, it'll enable us to do things a bit better than we can at the moment. But I think those kind of critical things we have to do as transport planners, I think we can still do it. So I'd like to think either direction, we're fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just sticking to the script on uncertainty, which is fair enough. And Jim, you'd said in not so many words, a beautiful structure full of garbage, I think was your phrase. And that reminded me of Anna and her sewing machine, where I'm sort of imagining, at least at a glance, you think, well, that top looks fantastic and it's only £2.99. Brilliant that I managed to produce that with this sewing machine. And it's only after the first wash, when it falls apart and loses all its colour, that you realise you've been hoodwinked and should have focused on getting the right tool for the right job with the right skills to use the tool. And I suppose I'd like to come to you all in a moment for sort of closing remarks. As usual, time has run away with us. But I'd like your takeaways, particularly feeding back again with the audience in mind, either what you've learned from today yourselves, what stood out from the conversation, or a pearl of wisdom or some advice you'd like to offer. I can see, sorry, I'm just distracted by another comment. I'm pretty sure most non-sewers would be aware they created wearable clothes. Very often not the case with AI. Thank you for that. That's a pearl of wisdom straight off from the audience. I think the conclusion I've come to is, broadly speaking, we needn't, at an existential level, what does this mean for society and humanity at large? Those are bigger questions. But within our own kind of lane, within our sector and our professional lives, I don't think for those of us in transport, this is an existential threat. I think it's more banal than that. But it's a reminder that, as has always been the case, we need to work smarter. We need to embrace critical thinking and lifelong learning and keep being adaptive and agile to the changing nature of the world of work we're in and the resources available to us. I think, as Michaela said, it's created some consternation and shake-up at the moment. We're in a bit of a storm, but that doesn't mean it's going to be a storm that keeps getting worse and worse and fundamentally undermines our raison d'etre. So that's my last say. Like to do a round robin, as I say, to reach the finish line. So, Tom, should we start with you, and then I'll come to Jim, Michaela, and Janice.
Okay, thanks. Well, it's been really interesting, and I really like the fact that while there's a diversity of opinion here, there is a common sense that this is something we need to approach with caution. And I just wanted to kind of end with a reflection on the sewing machine example. Sewing machines are relatively safe systems in the sense that you have to be pretty ingenious to cause yourself harm with a sewing machine. And I think we need to be cautious about this idea that because it's a general purpose tool, because AI is a general purpose tool, what people do with it is their own problem. And I think in particular, we've got a lot of hype, and there are a lot of organizations, governmental organizations and businesses, which need some support, should I say? I was going to say protection. Support from people who know what's going on and understand the risks to protect them from from self-harming accidentally.
Thanks, Tom. Jim, your minute to finish off, please.
So I guess I'm feeling broadly positive. I think feeding back on Tom's point. So in health-related research, if most health-related projects need to have a significant amount of public involvement and engagement not in a whitewashing sense, but very much in co-designing and framing the problem, the questions that are being asked. And that's just routine of stuff. And I think that if we're going to make safe systems, we need to have as many voices as possible embedded in that creation process, so that we're making sure that we're getting all those perspectives of safety for who and under what circumstances, to make sure that we don't do the inadvertent thing, or to not make sure, but reduce the likelihood.
That's a great point, Jim. Thank you. Very much in line with dealing with wicked problems and having a plurality of views. Michaela. Oh, you're on mute. And by the way, I know it's not just you. I love the fact as humans we discuss these highly cutting edge technical problems and still find ourselves wrestling with the microphones and headphones. Michaela, over to you.
Yeah. What I think I've enjoyed today is hearing about the ethical side of things, and it's made me kind of think, we know the systems that have been created inherently, you can go back to when towns and cities were first being built. Are we still grappling those societal decisions, and now we're having to, in the modern world, fix those societal issues while also continuing as a society? And is it maybe AI is not the answer to fixing what was being decided policy-wise hundreds of years ago, or even just 100 years ago, however long, that maybe actually AI is maybe the tool that helps us get to that step of actually unwinding those decisions that previous generations actually decided. And I think if you recognize a problem, then you have at least a major tool to solve that problem. And maybe we don't have to worry about repeating those mistakes because we already recognize that problem.
Janice.
I've personally really enjoyed this discussion. I think at the end of the day, it's probably worth noting, we're doing this we're doing this kind of webinar in person, having the discussion. We just had a 90-minute discussion with each other. So I think there's obviously something to be said about the value. Obviously, us as humans, we bring our original thought, our original critical thinking that we bring, and whatever AGI super intelligence comes in, it's and because intelligence or like critical thinking has become very accessible, and you're just able to like are cheap in a way. You're able to just ask a question and you get an answer. There's that tendency to like think, oh, what value do I bring? What as a human. But I think it's just a reminder that that's not loss. Like our experiences in the transport world itself, like everyone's lived experiences in the transport world, in our own little sectors, I think we bring value. So it's not forgetting that, I think.
Thanks, Janice.
Kind of
Okay, so
yeah.
we're all in still with a shout for the future. That's great. I know we're a minute over, but Shania, can I pass back to you with thanks from me to our audience and to our wonderful panel?
Yeah, just to retweet that, thank you for everyone that registered for the event, that attended live, those that are now catching up on the recording. We really appreciate all the comments and questions that came into the chat as well for the panel. Yeah, thank you to all of our speakers, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care, everyone. Bye.